A united Balkan peninsula. A wet dream for some, an unheard nightmare for others. And for most of us, a history and future so distant and alternate that it's not even worth polemicizing about. But what if I told you that the idea of uniting the Balkans into one country, one federation, hasn't been as improbable throughout history as it maybe sounds today? You'd actually be surprised that this project isn't only communist drivel and utopian fairy tales of some virgin daydreamer, but something that many intellectuals, organizations, and governments have very seriously considered and attempted many times throughout the troubled history of the so-called powder keg of Europe. And speaking of which, it might even surprise you that this notion of instability, intrigue, and troubles that gave the peninsula its nickname is more of a baseless Orientalist caricature than a useful and sober outlook on our actual history. While the tendency to conquer and fight certainly has been a noteworthy part of the Balkan experience, the tendency to unite should by no means be underestimated. And in this video, we'll take a look at precisely that. The integration and rapprochement of Balkan peoples following the collapse of both of their oppressors, the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, had been a long and turbulent process. There were many lesser-known historical movements that led up to the more famous projects for Balkan unity. So let's take a look at this intriguing journey, which is so often overshadowed by these grim tales of Balkan hatred and fragmentation. The first half of the 19th century saw the development of small, weak, and intensely nationalistic Balkan states that were emerging from the dying Ottoman corpse and were self-absorbed in their internal problems of trying to repair the damage from centuries of neglect and exploitation. Meanwhile, the decrepit Ottoman Empire was still limping along, despite the ever louder calls for revolution and national liberation of enslaved peoples, although with very little foresight about the peninsula as a whole. Already here, the Illyrian movement with Ljudevit Gai in Croatia and the Načrtanje program of Ilija Garašin and Outland in Serbia were formulating the first conceptions of a new Yugoslavian state. The Romanian principalities were also swept by revolutionary wind that seek to establish national unity. However, it is apparent that in this period before 1848, a federation movement was virtually non-existent in the Balkans. The great powers, especially Britain, Austria, and Russia, were determined to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, as was evidenced in 1832 and 1839. Accordingly, they were opposed to any united Balkan action which might jeopardize Turkish rule. The Balkan states, on the other hand, were uniformly weak and unstable, and were interested only in gaining their independence and extending their frontiers. During the revolution of 1848, the Romanian and the Yugoslav movements for national unity were diverted and utilized for the defense of the Habsburg Empire. Not all, however, was pure loss. The national unification movements had been temporarily checkmated, but the desire for unity remained. If the Turkish and Austrian empires were to be overthrown, it was apparent now that the subject peoples should practice cooperation rather than mutual extermination. Accordingly, in the decade after 1849, repeated efforts were made to unite the peoples of southeastern Europe against their oppressors and to set up a Danubian Federation of free nation-states. The first proposals for this curious project emerged in the midst of the 1848 revolution in Austria, where Hungarian statesman Lajos Kossuth saw the necessity for joint action of Serbs, Hungarians, and Romanians in their resistance against their Austrian and Russian oppressors. Their negotiations repeatedly failed, however, due to two conflicting conceptions. The one aiming to maintain Hungarian territorial integrity as a unitary state, and those striving towards confederalization. The latter one aimed for the creation of the United States of the Danube, which would include Hungary, Serbia, Moldavia, Wallachia, Bukovina, and Bessarabia. This more decentralized approach was akin to the upcoming Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, but was aiming to balance out three sides instead of two. But all these integrative efforts ended up failing under similar circumstances, their origin always being short-sighted particularist interests of the local ruling elites, which wanted a larger portion of the pie to themselves, at the detriment of the interests of the wider working population. With the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, the Danubian Federation movement, for all intents and purposes, came to a bitter end. In short, each of these groups was interested in the Federation movement not for its own sake, but only insofar it might satisfy its national aspirations. Once these were fulfilled, at least partially by the union of the principalities and by the Ausgleich, the Danubian Federation movement automatically became extinct. Incorrigible revolutionists like Mazzini continued to agitate for the overthrow of the Ottoman and Habsburg empires and for the establishment of democratic federations, but their activities were of little practical significance. Rather, the center of interest now shifted to Belgrade, where Prince Mihailo was successfully negotiating with his neighbors for the formation of a purely Balkan alliance system directed primarily against Turkey rather than Austria. But one thing is for sure. Regardless of what time period or historical figure we're talking about, you gotta admit that those beards and mustaches are something to behold. And if you've ever wondered if that amount of drip is even attainable, no worries, because Manscaped, the sponsor of today's video, has got you covered. With the might of their Beard Hedger Pro Kit at your disposal, anything is possible. Now obviously, the star of the game is the Beard Hedger Trimmer. The powerful 7200 RPM motor and titanium-coated T-blade can cut through the thickest of hair in a single stroke. Being waterproof, cordless, and rechargeable, you can easily trim in the shower to save time and create less mess. And to top it all off, Manscaped also created dermatologist-tested beard care products to help you grow and nourish a magnificent beard. I mean, imagine if Marks & Engels had the oil, shampoo, conditioner, and this nicely scented beard balm. Those beards would be even more legendary. So what are you waiting for? Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping when you use the promo code Balkan at checkout. Thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So in the upcoming period, just as the Italians were being united into one nation, so the Yugoslav dreamed of being liberated from Austrian and Ottoman rule and being united into one great, independent South Slav state. Prince Mihailo Obrenović shared these aspirations. His ambition was to make Serbia the Piedmont of the Balkans. But since Serbia was too weak to act alone, Mihailo devoted himself to the task of uniting the Balkan states in preparation for a war of liberation. Joint action was instigated between the Serbian, Greek, Romanian, and Bulgarian ruling classes through the establishment of various shared committees, whose purpose was to prepare the people for a common revolt against the Turks, and to create independent or autonomous states in Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Epirus, Herzegovina, Albania, and Bulgaria, all of which should eventually unite in a confederacy. In the following years, several Balkan alliances were signed, seeking to secure their autonomy without direct foreign aid, giving birth to an entire system of Serbo-Romanian, Greco-Serbian, and Serb-Montenegrin alliances, while Serbia and Bulgaria were in serious talks of creating a common state under the name Yugoslavia. Serbia also sought to rally support from Orthodox Albanians and Montenegrins against Turkey. Meanwhile, Greece was aiming to form alliances with Romania, Montenegro, and even Egypt, of which only the one with Serbia ended up actually materializing, where the future partition of Ottoman-held territories was already being arranged. But, as promising as these aspirations may sound, they proved to be a big disappointment. With a few notable exceptions, a Balkan Federation was not seriously considered, and relations were filled with calculations, indecisiveness, and distrust. The nature of the negotiations indicate clearly that each side was more interested in ensuring its future expansion than in furthering the Federation cause. Conflicting territorial ambitions of the local ruling classes, primarily around the region of Macedonia, began to emerge, seeking to expand the influence of their domestic capital, combined with the centrifugal forces of the great powers, primarily Austria-Hungary and Russia, aiming to establish political and economic hegemony. Both the Greek and the Bulgarian ruling class were laying claim to Macedonia and Thrace, while the Serbian one was demanding Old Serbia and planning to establish hegemony over other Yugoslav states in their self-image as the naturally destined leaders of a Serb-oriented Yugoslav state. Ultimately, the nail in the coffin was the assassination of Mihailo Obrenović in 1868, which sowed chaos in Serbian politics and threw it into an internal crisis which diluted their foreign policy. Serbia being the linchpin of this fragile pan-Balkan alliance system, any hopes for Balkan integration, which in 1866 seemed so promising, had completely disintegrated by 1870. Due to various opportunistic and narrow-minded interests, alliances were dissipating one by one, and relations were becoming strained as old territorial feuds reignited, sparking a fratricidal war between Serbia and Bulgaria in 1885. Any feeble attempts to re-establish relations always ended up succumbing to more isolationist and particularist currents, and those leaning on the malicious patronage of Vienna or Moscow. A perfect display of these contradictory relations would be the establishment of the Balkan League between Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro, and their instigation of the First and Second Balkan Wars. The first can be seen as an example of promising rapprochement and united action against the Turks, whereas the second one again showed the ugly face of national megalomania with the League's subsequent war with Bulgaria. The lines drawn with these explosive events soon escalated in the form of World War I, where instead of aiming for integration, the peninsula fell into the complete opposite and stained Balkan relations even further. As always, the ruling classes of Balkan nations showed more enthusiasm for their narrow class interests than the common interests of the peasants and workers, a trend which continues to this very day. But it was exactly these failures of the ruling stratum of these small countries that gave the impetus to another, more radical and revolutionary approach to the Eastern question, led by the Balkan labor and agrarian parties. Since the beginning of this century, these parties have adopted and consistently championed the principle of Balkan Federation. They have given to the Federation movement a strength and mass basis which it previously lacked. They constituted the sole organized and effective force in favor of federation during the stormy years between the Balkan League of 1912 and the Balkan Conferences of the 1930s. In fact, their significance only grew as time went by. This is where Serbian socialists, with the paper Radnik, the Serbian Social Democratic Party, and with the guidance of figures such as Svetozar Marković and later on Dimitrije Tucović, first formulated their ideas. Among other fundamental changes to the status quo, Marković developed the thesis that national unity and freedom could only be attained by a general revolution and the establishment of a Balkan Federal Republic. He defined their aims as liberation and federation, first with the Bulgarians, and ultimately all Balkan peoples. Other notable figures would be Ion Gica, Ioan Bratinau, and Nicolae Balcescu in Romania, and Rigas Fereos Velestinlis in Greece. Similarly, Bulgarian radicals such as Georgi Rakovski, Ljuben Karavelov, and Hristo Botev were agitating for the necessity of a social revolution and establishment of a Balkan Federation. They were all opposed to foreign intervention, reliance upon foreign aid, and urged Balkan states to cooperate closely in order to get rid of foreign domination and to maintain their independence. Karavelov pointed out that exaggerated national aspirations based on past glory have no validity. He concluded, therefore, that only a federation would enable the Balkan peoples to live peacefully together. He proposed a federation consisting of Serbia with Bosnia-Herzegovina and Montenegro, Romania, Bulgaria with Thrace and Macedonia, Albania, and Greece with Thessaly and Epirus, and the Free City of Constantinople. However, there was little opportunity at this time to put any of these progressive aspirations into practice and to seriously influence geopolitical relations. The industrial backwardness of the peninsula made it impossible to build up powerful socialist parties, as was done during this period in France, Germany, and other Western European countries. It was not until the period of the Balkan and World Wars that the socialists were able to win much support for their anti-war and pro-federation politics. But until then, the bulk of political efforts remained in the hands of the ruling class, whereas the workers and peasants stayed as powerless as ever. However, the political intellectual atmosphere in Europe after World War I on the one hand, and the impact of the Great Depression on the agrarian states in the Balkans on the other, fueled the desire to search for solutions to common problems. The concern to unify winners and defeated in the war and to offer better prospects for economic development in the region led to the Balkan Conferences and the Balkan Entente as their aftermath. An important step in this process was the creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia on the corpse of Austria-Hungary, which, despite its many flaws and oppressive character as a prison cell of peoples, nonetheless strived towards integration. Moreover, in the 20th century, one can retrace a dozen well-documented negotiations on projects for Balkan integration that went beyond bilateral agreements. Surprisingly, Romania participated in most of them, despite not being considered a Balkan nation by many. As Preshlenova explains, unification should not only promote the entire development of the region, but also fulfill the motto, "The Balkans to the Balkan peoples," a common desire of almost all political leaders in the region. Early manifestations of this strive in the interwar period were the daily journal Balkanski Zgovor, Balkan Entente, founded in Sofia in 1915, but also the sudden enthusiasm coming from the United Kingdom with Winston Churchill. As he is quoted saying, "The creation of the Balkan Federation, comprising Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Montenegro, and Greece, strong enough to play an effective part in the destinies of Europe, must be a common dream for all their peoples." A confederation described by Churchill as a, quote, "brilliant but fleeting opportunity." In the period up until World War II, Great Britain began to encourage the creation of a confederation of Eastern and Southeastern European countries early on. But why? Well, expectedly, regional groupings during the war were to strengthen British control over the governments of the contracting countries. Regardless, the 1930s saw the founding of the League for the Rapprochement of the Serbs and Bulgarians and for the union of all the South Slavs. Despite all well-known political differences and mistrust, in the midst of the Great Depression and a deep agrarian crisis of the predominantly agrarian Balkan states, as well as the impetus given by rising pan-European unification movements, they concluded that the efforts of individual nations are no longer adequate for coping with such a situation, and that common action was necessary. And so, by 1929-1930, various bilateral agreements were signed between the bourgeois governments of Yugoslavia and Greece, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, Greece and Turkey, which culminated into the convention of the First Balkan Conference in 1930s in Athens, attended by the foreign ministers of Albania, Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. About 150 delegates, experts, observers, and prominent politicians attended the event, during which they considered all major aspects of economy, culture, and social life. It was felt that the process of fusion would be longer, starting with preliminary technical and economic agreements, followed by the formation of a customs agreement, and finally the creation of the Federation of Balkan States. And in case you're skeptical about the seriousness of this initiative, take a load of this. A Balkan flag with 6 golden stars and 6 stripes of white, blue, green, yellow, red, and white symbolized the future union, and a band played the Balkan Hymn of Peace, composed specifically for the auspicious event. The Balkan Olympic Games brought the youth of the peninsula together. It seemed that a new epoch in Balkan history was about to begin. Incredibly enough, the prospect of developing the Balkans into a great power through integration seemed to be the ultimate goal. Altogether, 4 annual conferences were held in Athens, Istanbul and Ankara, Bucharest, and Salonika. In this process, 6 commissions were appointed to study the various aspects of regional unification. The Commission on Economic Affairs studied in detail the economic position of every Balkan country and of the peninsula as a whole. It proposed measures for their improvement and for Balkan cooperation. The general aim was to protect agriculture and industry in the Balkans, as well as to adopt a concerted commercial policy, to promote collaboration between banks, and to investigate the possibility of a monetary union. The Commission on Communications accounted that direct connections between the Balkan states were still undeveloped, and not a single bridge spanned the Danube. The first conference adopted resolutions for the construction of direct rail, air, road, and telegraphic lines between all the capitals, and of the 2 main trunk lines, rail and road, from the Black Sea to the Adriatic, and from the Danube to the Aegean. The Commission on Intellectual Cooperation adopted a program calling for exchange of university students, professors, and intellectual associations, instruction in a Balkan language other than the one of the national state in all universities, teaching history as an aid to union, translation of Balkan folklore into the various Balkan languages, and the celebration of a Balkan week in each country at a fixed date. And the Commission on Social Policy urged that serious attention should be given to the precarious plight of the agricultural and industrial workers, pointing out that their support was a prerequisite to success. Resolutions were adopted in favor of the improvement and collaboration of sanitary services, abolition of child labor and prostitution, equal treatment of foreign workers, and so on. Altogether, the progressive legacy left behind by the conferences is evident by the various practical goals that were indeed achieved. However, despite agreements and ambitions on many socioeconomic questions, the political front had many obstacles that were difficult to overcome. Above all, it was the question of Bulgarian minorities in neighboring countries and their territorial ambitions regarding Macedonia that created hostilities between all involved Balkan states and Bulgaria. They ended up opting out and saw the pact as an anti-Bulgarian instrument aiming to quote-unquote encircle them. So, with Bulgaria completely antagonized, the foreign ministers of Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey ended up agreeing on a Balkan Pact, which they signed in Ankara in 1934, also known as the Balkan Entente. Altogether, as Preshlenova concludes, the Balkan conferences were a promising but fragile beginning of a rapprochement between the Balkan states. In contrast to all previous plans for regional integration that were directed against a common enemy and were thus anti in their character, They were pro-Balkan and pro-European. They brought together a part of the Balkan elites and demonstrated that they were capable of mutual understanding. But ultimately, despite all optimism, the Balkan conferences did not bring progress and prosperity to the predominantly agrarian and underdeveloped region, nor did they launch a new civilization. But there were no military conflicts on the peninsula until the Second World War. They, at the very least, maintained a peaceful territorial status quo and laid irredentist ambitions to rest. But by the 1940s, as many times before, wider historical conjunctures ensured that pan-Balkan ambitions would never truly materialize. The rise of Hitler and Mussolini and disruption of the European status quo led to trade dependence, economic and political subservience to Nazi Germany, which stimulated reactionary, isolationist, and fascist currents that ended up prevailing in most of the Balkans. With rabid chauvinism, war destruction, and genocide, they had undone all of the progress and dragged the Balkans into the deepest depths of hell. In the darkest hours of the fascist inferno of an occupied and dismembered Yugoslavia, with Nazi-quisling governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania, and a raging civil war in Greece, mass resistance erupted in the form of a national liberation struggle, led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. It served as the main instigator and linchpin of the wider movement of anti-fascist resistance in the Balkans and beyond. The Yugoslav partisans offer their solidarity through moral, military, personnel, political, and financial support to all enslaved neighboring peoples fighting for liberation. To name only a few examples, by helping the formation of the Communist Party of Albania and aiding the establishment of Albanian statehood, through cooperation with Albanian partisans and the Bulgarian Otechestveni Front, by helping the Bulgarian Workers' Party consolidate power, by sending detachments to Hungary and Romania, and later on sending mass aid to the KKE in the Greek Civil War, and supporting the Aegean Macedonians' right to self-determination. Together with a third of the world population, the Balkan Peninsula finally liberated itself from imperialism by 1945 and embarked on the quest of developing new social relations. In this massive upheaval, Yugoslavia and Albania liberated themselves autonomously, while Romania and Bulgaria established revolutionary governments with the help of the USSR, whereas Greece fell victim to Stalin's geopolitical games with the West and ended its civil war on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In this revolutionary context, the new Balkan governments, based on the political will of the working class, began a campaign of rapprochement and integration, based on the principle of establishing world peace with mutual tolerance, equality, and each nation's right to self-determination. Various agreements on economic cooperation and friendship and mutual assistance were signed in 1946 between Yugoslavia and Albania, USSR, Poland, Czechoslovakia, as well as Romania and Hungary in 1947. Various instances of material, economic, political, and intellectual aid unconditionally flowed from Yugoslavia to other Balkan countries, displaying unseen levels of solidarity with all working peoples of the Balkans and the rest of the Eastern Bloc and the Global South in the harsh post-war period. This selfless internationalist policy and solidarity which radiated from Yugoslavia and its neighbors, deemed as a utopian pipe dream by cynical reactionaries, was a tangible reality after World War II with loads of documented evidence. Following years of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and destruction, ignited by their self-serving ruling classes, Balkan workers and peasants finally took things into their own hands and were paving the path towards a future of international peace and solidarity. Expectedly, this kind of policy, initially strongly encouraged by the USSR, was by no means desirable for imperialist forces, which strived, as they always have, to sabotage the cooperation and rapprochement of Balkan and Danube countries. But this aspiration has always been opposed by the leaders of other nations, inciting friction between them, pushing them into mutual wars, turning them into a currency for the settling of debts between imperialist states. That is why friendly relations with Slavic countries were useful for Bulgaria, especially with the fraternal Yugoslavia. Thus, the mutual affinity of Josip Broz Tito and Georgi Dimitrov led to the culmination of all historical attempts at Balkan unity. At the meeting of representatives of Yugoslavia and Bulgaria in Bled in late July and early August of 1947, the Bled Agreement was concluded, which paved the way for the creation of a Balkan Federation in the future, foreseeing maximum exchange of goods, a new regime of mutual ownership of estates, and preparation for the creation of a customs union. In the same year, the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance was signed between Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, which signified a new era of the most intimate socio-economic cooperation. It was supposed to be the first decisive step in the peaceful resolution of a whole set of problems and long-standing misunderstandings between the two Balkan states, with the obvious tendency of building socialist social relations. It was expected that the Tito-Dimitrov-Bled agreements would eventually, when the passions heated up in the Second World War subsided, pave the way for both Greece and Turkey to approach the peaceful resolution of disputes and accept the principle of Balkan cooperation and solidarity, as Albania had already done with similar agreements with Yugoslavia. Upon the ratification of the same agreements with Hungary and Romania, Tito's closest associate, Edvard Kardelj, proclaimed, "These agreements, first of all, tell us that the Balkans and the Danube region have come to the end of a long-lasting, ferocious, and bloody imperialist game that for a long period poisoned the relations between the peoples in that part of Europe, threw them into mutual conflicts, and subjected them to fierce imperialist exploitation. These documents, therefore, mean that the peoples of the Balkans and the Danube region want to be truly independent, that is, politically and economically independent from the imperialists. And this means that they no longer want to be exploited as an agrarian appendage and a source of raw materials for the imperialists, but to, with mutual cooperation, embark upon the path of progress, people's democracy, and all-rounded economic development. With full right, therefore, the free peoples in the east of Europe unite in order to reject any thought of the imperialist forces that they will be able to provoke one people against another, or that they will be able to engage in uncontrolled and unhindered incitement to war by blackmail, intimidation, and extortion. But then something rather unexpected happened. Following the formation of the Cominform, also known as the Information Bureau of the Communist and Workers' Parties, and despite his initial insistence to form a Yugoslav-Bulgarian Federation, which the Yugoslav temporarily rejected for complex reasons, Joseph Stalin and the Moscow administration suddenly began condemning those tendencies altogether and aiming to cut them at the root. But why on earth would they ever do that? Well, having noticed that the Tito-Dimitrov and all other pan-Balkan negotiations were happening without the approval of the USSR, the quote pragmatist tendencies of Stalin's and Molotov's statist realpolitik and his balancing acts with imperialism overshadowed all underlying Marxist-Leninist principles of self-determination and led to a geopolitical conflict of interest directed against the perceived autonomism of Tito and Dimitrov. In turn, the Muscovite paper Pravda attacked Dimitrov's plan of a Balkan Danubian Federation, calling it unrealistic because apparently those nations do not need a federation, a confederation, a customs union, etc. And as Stalin directly attacked him in front of both delegations by saying, "You wanted to shine by using some novel words." That is completely wrong, because such a federation is unattainable. Combined with other instances of autonomous decision-making of the Yugoslav communists without prior consultation with Moscow, and the refusal to become economically and politically subservient to the USSR as this archetypal cradle of socialism, the gradual and painful isolation and demonization of Yugoslavia from the rest of the Cominform had begun, despite it socioeconomically being literally a carbon copy of the Soviet model. First, through economic and political pressures, and then unprincipled slander, Yugoslavia was harshly ostracized because its views often misaligned with the expected monolithism and obedience to compulsory directives coming from Moscow. This unprincipled campaign resulted in the infamous resolution of the Inform Bureau in 1948, also known as the Tito-Stalin split, whose details and controversies I will be covering in an upcoming video very soon. Nonetheless, it turned all Eastern European countries, which up until yesterday were conducting an intimate and tightly knit friendship with Yugoslavia, suddenly against it, parroting denunciation and slander coming from Moscow. Seemingly out of nowhere, tens of thousands of Soviet, Hungarian, Romanian, and Bulgarian troops were put on standby on the Yugoslav border, threatening to wake the ghosts of the past and push the Balkans into yet another catastrophe. What truly stood behind this tragic turn of events and how it ended is, as mentioned, a topic for another time. What is certain, however, is that the events of 1948 prevented the materialization of one of the most ambitious and progressive projects in European history, a revolutionary wave that imperialists openly loathed and local nationalists were unable to stop. What dug the grave to the Balkan Federation was, deeply ironically, not imperialist sabotage or local fascists, but bureaucratic reactionaries deeply embedded into every fiber of being of the USSR that Yugoslavs always looked up to so hopefully. A ruling class of bureaucrats and opportunists that held enough power in the USSR and used all of its might to once again destroy the fragile solidarity of Balkan peoples for the sake of socio-political hegemony over the Eastern Bloc. Ultimately, this paved the path for the gradual fragmentation and bureaucratization of Balkan revolutionary sentiment, and ultimately to the bloody and devastating collapse of all resemblances of socialism some 4 decades later. Had the dream of the Balkan Federation persisted, had the material conditions and progressive forces been mature enough to resist the impetus of Moscow to divide and conquer, then maybe, just maybe, socialism would have had more of a chance to prevail and the Balkans could have enjoyed a different fate. But not all is pure loss, for we have the rich experience, the mistakes and deficiencies of our predecessors to learn from and to do better ourselves in the future. And how this potential future might look like and how to achieve it, we'll explore in the next video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for part 2.